The millionaire CEO went undercover expecting numbers and reports, but what he found was a waitress asleep in a booth, and his next move shocked everyone. The restaurant was nearly empty when Alexander Hale pushed open the glass door and stepped. Inside, the soft jingle of the bell overhead announcing his arrival. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary man. Dark hair that fell loosely across his forehead, a plain shirt with the sleeves rolled casually to his elbows, and brown eyes that held no hint of recognition. There was nothing in his appearance that suggested the truth, that he was a 30-year-old CEO, a millionaire whose name was whispered with reverence in corporate circles. Tonight, he was not Alexander Hale the Powerful. Tonight, he was simply Alex, a stranger, blending into the hum of a late-night diner. He had been moving through his restaurant chain quietly for weeks, slipping into different locations to see what really happened when no one knew the owner was watching. Years of success had taught him that reports and polished numbers rarely told the whole story. If he wanted the truth, he had to see it for himself. So here he was, seated at a corner booth, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him, watching the staff with a detached but careful eye. That was when he noticed her. She moved between tables with a practiced grace, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, though a few strands escaped to brush her flushed cheeks. Her uniform was spotless, though the exhaustion in her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. She smiled at customers, polite and warm, but the smile never reached her eyes. Alexander watched as she balanced a tray in one hand, scribbled an order with the other, and still managed to murmur a kind word to a frazzled mother juggling her child. He asked the hostess her name casually, as if it were an idle curiosity. "Emma Brooks," came the reply. 27 years old. New to this location. He stored the information away silently, sipping his coffee and letting his gaze follow her through the dimly lit dining room. By midnight, the diner had emptied, the clatter of dishes fading to silence. Alexander lingered, his presence unnoticed in the shadowed booth. He saw her wiping tables, collecting menus, stacking chairs. Her movements slower now, her shoulders sagging with the weight of exhaustion. She disappeared into the back for several minutes, and when she returned, she walked not to the counter, but to one of the empty booths near the wall. She sank into the seat, slipped her apron off, and let her head fall onto folded arms. Within seconds, she was asleep. Alexander froze, his hand still on the coffee cup. He had seen employees tired before, but this was different. There was something about the way she collapsed, as though she had been holding herself together for hours and only now allowed herself to break. It wasn't the careless nap of someone bored. It was the desperate surrender of someone who had nothing left to give. He leaned back, watching her in the faint glow of the overhead lights. The room was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For a long moment, he felt an ache in his chest he hadn't expected. He thought of his own early years, the nights he had spent chasing contracts, pushing past exhaustion until his body screamed in protest. But even then, he had the safety net of ambition and the promise of reward. This woman had neither. She had only exhaustion and survival. When the night manager walked past, he glanced at Emma and frowned, muttering under his breath about lazy staff. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Not yet. He wanted to understand first. Emma stirred slightly, shifting in her sleep, her blonde hair falling across her face. She looked younger like this, vulnerable in a way that cut through Alexander's carefully built detachment. She had no idea the owner of the restaurant chain was watching her from across the room. No idea that her silent struggle had already caught his attention. And as Alexander sat in the dim light, he realized that this night, what began as a routine undercover visit was already turning into something else. Something heavier, sharper, and far more personal than he had expected. The following evening, Alexander returned to the same restaurant, slipping through the door unnoticed just as he had the night before. He wore a different shirt, a baseball cap pulled low over his dark hair, but his sharp brown eyes missed nothing. He told himself he was only following up, checking consistency, observing staff, but the truth pressed heavier on him. He couldn't shake the image of Emma Brooks asleep in that booth, her body curled in exhaustion, her blonde hair falling across her arms. It haunted him in a way numbers and reports never had. The diner was busier than usual, a small dinner rush with couples, families, and late workers crowding into the booths. Alexander sat quietly in a corner again, coffee in hand, blending into the background. From his seat, he watched Emma weave between tables. Her smile was brighter tonight, more practiced, but he noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she pressed her hand briefly against her lower back when she thought no one was looking. When she came by his table, pad in hand, she didn't recognize him. Why would she? To her, he was just another tired man in a worn jacket. "Coffee refilled?" she asked with a small, polite smile. "Yes, please," Alexander said, his voice calm, almost soft. He studied her face closely. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, the kind that even makeup couldn't fully hide. "Busy night?" he added. Emma shrugged, a practiced motion, and poured his refill. "It's always busy," she said, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet acceptance. He wanted to press, to ask why someone her age looked so utterly drained, but he bit back the urge. Instead, he let her leave, watching as she hurried to another table, jotting down orders while balancing trays with the efficiency of someone used to carrying more than she should. Later, as the crowd thinned, Alexander caught snippets of conversation between staff. A hostess whispered to the cook that Emma had taken another double shift. A busboy joked that she practically lived there, sleeping in the booths instead of at home. They laughed, but the sound made Alexander's stomach tighten. So it wasn't a one-time accident. She was burning herself out day after day, and the people around her dismissed it as if it were nothing more than a quirk. When Emma finally had a moment to breathe, Alexander spoke again. "You work a lot," he said, his voice low, almost conversational. She glanced at him, startled by the observation. "That's kind of the job," she replied with a quick shrug, trying to brush it off. "Not like this," he countered gently. "Most people don't work until they collapse." For a moment, her composure slipped. Her eyes flickered with something. Fear, shame, maybe both. She busied herself straightening silverware on the table. "It's fine," she murmured. "Really, I can handle it." Alexander didn't believe her, but he didn't push further. He knew people like her, people who had trained themselves never to show weakness. He had been one once. He simply nodded, as though satisfied, and let her go. By midnight, the crowd had dispersed, and Alexander remained in his booth, pretending to read the menu while keeping her in his peripheral vision. He watched her clean tables, refill condiments, and then, when no one was watching, paused to rub her temples as though warding off a pounding headache. The manager barked an order from across the room, and she flinched slightly before moving to comply. Something twisted in Alexander's chest. He had come undercover to test efficiency, to measure productivity. Instead, he was watching a young woman fight exhaustion like it was her second skin. She wasn't lazy, as some might assume. She was drowning, and no one seemed to care. As the night wound down, Emma carried the last tray of dishes to the kitchen. Alexander rose slowly from his seat, leaving cash on the table. For a brief second, he considered walking out, letting the story end here. After all, CEOs weren't supposed to get involved in the private lives of waitresses. But as he glanced back one final time, he saw her leaning against the counter, her eyes closed, lips pressed together in silent fatigue. That was when he knew he wouldn't walk away. Not this time. Emma Brooks wasn't just another employee in his chain. She was a human being whose struggle had already left a mark on him. And whether she realized it or not, her story was about to change. Because Alexander Hale had decided he could no longer remain just an observer. The following night, Alexander returned again, this time earlier in the evening, when the restaurant was already buzzing with activity. He slipped into his usual booth, the same one that gave him a clear view of the floor. To anyone else, he was just another customer, a man with a quiet demeanor and a taste for strong coffee. But inside, Alexander was restless, his thoughts circling the same point. Emma Brooks. He told himself it was part of his mission as an undercover CEO, that he needed to understand his employees' lives beyond the spreadsheets. Yet the truth was simpler. He wanted to know her story. Emma was working her shift as always, moving quickly between tables. She greeted families with warm smiles, joked lightly with a pair of teenagers, and carefully placed a steaming bowl of soup before an older man. Watching her, Alexander realized she had perfected the art of masking fatigue. To the customers, she was cheerful, efficient, tireless. But he knew better now. He had seen the exhaustion hiding in her eyes, the way she folded into herself when no one was looking. When the rush slowed and her tables were cleared, Alexander seized the moment. He raised his hand slightly, and she approached his booth with her notepad, her blonde hair pulled back neatly, but with strands falling loose around her face. "The usual coffee?" she asked with a faint smile. "Yes," he said. Then after a pause, "And maybe some company, if you don't mind." Her brow furrowed, caught off guard. Waitresses weren't often asked to sit down, especially by customers who didn't look like they wanted anything more than silence. For a second, she seemed ready to politely decline, but something in his expression, calm, steady, without expectation, made her hesitate. She slid into the booth across from him, resting the notepad on the table. "You don't strike me as someone who talks much," she said cautiously. "I don't," Alexander admitted, "but sometimes silence hides more than words do." He studied her for a moment before adding, "You look like you carry a lot." Emma stiffened slightly, her mask slipping for just a breath. She picked at the corner of the notepad, her fingers restless. "I guess we all do," she murmured. "Bills, family, life. Nothing new." "Most people don't fall asleep at work from nothing," he said quietly, careful not to sound accusatory. Her eyes widened, and she glanced around quickly, as though terrified someone had overheard. "You saw that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did," he said simply. Emma lowered her gaze, shame coloring her cheeks. For a long moment she was silent, debating whether to defend herself or retreat into silence. But exhaustion has a way of stripping people of their defenses. Finally she sighed. "I work too many hours. Rent doesn't wait. Neither do debts. Sometimes it's just easier to push through than to stop." Alexander leaned forward slightly, his brown eyes intent. "Easier or necessary?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Both, maybe. I've been on my own for a long time. No parents close by, no partner to lean on. It's just me. And me isn't enough most days." She paused, then quickly shook her head. "I shouldn't even be saying this. Customers don't come here to hear the waitress's life story." "I asked," Alexander replied firmly. "That makes it different." She glanced at him, searching his face for mockery, but found none. His expression was steady, serious, almost disarming. For reasons she couldn't quite understand, words began spilling out, the things she usually swallowed down. She told him about working back-to-back shifts, about turning down invitations from friends because she couldn't afford to waste hours she could be earning money. She confessed how sometimes she skipped meals so she could save enough to keep up with her bills. Alexander listened without interrupting, every detail settling heavily in his chest. He thought about his own life, about the boardrooms, the endless meetings, the empire he had built brick by brick. He had fought battles of his own, but never like this. He had resources, connections, safety nets. She had none of those. When she finally stopped, Emma looked away, embarrassed. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she muttered. "Maybe because you don't look like the type to care." He smiled faintly, a smile she didn't expect. "Maybe I care more than you think." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Emma's eyes softened, though she quickly masked it with a practiced smile. She rose from the booth, grabbing her notepad again. "Your coffee will be ready in a minute," she said, her voice lighter. But her gaze lingered on him, just a second longer than before. As she walked away, Alexander leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He had uncovered her struggle, not all of it, but enough to know she was drowning in a fight she never should have faced alone. And he felt something stirring inside him, something dangerous for a man in his position, the need to protect, to intervene, to change her story. That night, when the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, Alexander didn't just leave with the memory of Emma asleep in a booth. He left with her, words echoing in his mind, a quiet vow forming in his heart. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, but one thing was certain. He could no longer see her as just another employee. The night was unusually tense inside the restaurant. Alexander had chosen once again to remain late, hidden in plain sight in his corner booth, sipping at his coffee and watching. Something in the air told him that tonight would not pass quietly. Emma moved quickly between tables, her smile fixed but brittle, her movements sharper than usual, as though her body was fighting to keep up with demands it could no longer meet. By the time the last customers had drifted out, the clock edging past midnight, Emma's steps had slowed. The dining room was quiet, the clinking of dishes from the kitchen the only sound that lingered. She moved through the empty tables, collecting menus, stacking chairs, and wiping surfaces with tired precision. Alexander saw her shoulders droop when she thought no one was looking. She pushed herself until there was nothing left, and then pushed further. When she finally sat down in one of the booths, clutching a rag loosely in her hand, Alexander knew what was coming before it happened. Her eyes fluttered closed, her body surrendering, her blonde head bowing against her arms. Within moments, she was asleep. But this time, she wasn't alone for long. The night manager, a stocky man with a sharp voice and little patience, stormed out from the back. He stopped in his tracks when he spotted Emma slumped in the booth. His face twisted with irritation, and his voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "Unbelievable," he barked, striding toward her. "Asleep on the job again? Do you think this is some kind of hotel?" Emma startled awake, blinking rapidly, her face flushing with embarrassment. I, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Save it," the manager snapped. "I should fire you on the spot. Do you realize how unprofessional this is? Customers could have seen you. You make this place look like a joke." Emma stammered, her hands trembling as she tried to stand. "Please, I've been working doubles all week. I'll finish cleaning, I promise." But the manager cut her off, his voice rising. "No excuses, you're done. Clean out your things. I won't tolerate laziness in my restaurant." Before Emma could respond, Alexander rose from his booth, his steps measured but purposeful. His tall frame seemed to carry a weight the manager had not noticed before. His calm brown eyes fixed on him with quiet authority. "That's enough," Alexander said, his voice low but edged with steel. The manager turned, startled. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. She's an employee and she—" "It concerns me more than you realize," Alexander interrupted, his tone sharper now. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space. Emma stared at him, confused and wide-eyed, as if seeing him for the first time. "You're treating her like she's disposable," Alexander continued, "like her exhaustion is a crime instead of a symptom of being overworked and undervalued. She isn't lazy. She's drowning under the weight of hours no one should be forced to carry." The manager sputtered, his face reddening. "Who are you to tell me how to run my staff? This is my responsibility." Alexander's expression hardened, the mask of anonymity slipping away. It's mine." The room went still. The words hung heavy in the air, and realization dawned on the manager's face, draining the color from it. Emma blinked, staring between them, struggling to process what she had just heard. Alexander straightened, his voice calm but commanding. "My name is Alexander Hale. I own this restaurant. In fact, I own every restaurant in this chain. And you," he fixed the manager with a glare that made him shrink, "have just shown me exactly why employees like Emma are breaking under the system." The manager's mouth opened and closed, words failing him. Alexander turned slightly, his gaze softening as it landed on Emma. She looked frozen, her lips parted, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're not fired," Alexander said to her firmly. "You're not even close to it. You've been caring more than anyone should, and it ends here. You deserve respect, Emma. You deserve better." Her throat tightened, her hands trembling against the edge of the booth. She didn't know what to say. The man she thought was just another quiet customer had transformed before her eyes into someone powerful. Someone who had just upended everything she thought she knew. The manager muttered an apology, retreating quickly, leaving Alexander and Emma in the quiet dining room. For a long moment, neither spoke. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. "You," she finally whispered. "You're the owner?" Alexander nodded slowly, his dark hair catching the faint light. "I didn't want you to know. I came here to see the truth behind the reports, and I found it. I found you." Emma shook her head, overwhelmed. Why would you even care what happens to me? You're a millionaire, a CEO. People like me don't matter to people like you." Alexander stepped closer, his voice steady, almost gentle now. "That's where you're wrong. People like you matter the most. You're the reason any of this exists at all, and I care because I've seen too much to ignore it." Her eyes filled with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. The exhaustion, the humiliation, the sheer weight of everything threatened to spill over, but Alexander's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. In that moment, Emma Brooks realized her life had changed forever. The undercover customer was no customer at all. He was the man who had the power to rewrite her story, and he had just chosen to stand on her side. Emma couldn't sleep that night. Long after she returned to her tiny apartment, she lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, replaying every moment of the confrontation in the restaurant. The image of Alexander standing there, calm but commanding, revealing himself as the owner of the chain, it looped endlessly in her mind. She remembered the way her manager's face had drained of color, the way Alexander's words had silenced the room. And then she remembered his gaze on her, steady, unwavering, as if she wasn't just another employee, but someone who mattered. The thought made her chest tighten with conflicting emotions. Gratitude surged first. He had defended her when no one else ever had, risked exposing himself to protect her. But alongside gratitude came something sharper. Shame. It burned in her stomach as she thought of how pathetic she must have looked. Caught asleep on the job, broken down in front of the very man who could decide her future. She had wanted to be invisible, and instead she had been exposed in the harshest way possible. The next day at work, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew. Whispers followed her as she walked through the dining room, trays balanced carefully in her hands. "That's her," some of the staff murmured. "She's the one he defended. The one the CEO singled out." Their voices carried equal parts envy and suspicion. Emma kept her head down, her smile fixed, pretending not to hear. But every word landed like a weight on her shoulders. When Alexander walked in later that evening, dressed in the same understated way he always had during his undercover visits, the air seemed to shift instantly. Employees straightened, customers glanced up, and Emma froze in place. She hadn't expected to see him so soon. Her heart raced as he crossed the room, ignoring the stares that followed him, and slid into his usual booth. For several minutes, she avoided going near him, sending another waitress to drop off his coffee. But eventually she could no longer escape. She approached his table, notepad in hand, her expression carefully neutral. "Everything all right tonight, Mr. Hale?" she asked quietly, her voice low enough that others couldn't overhear. He looked at her with a faint smile that seemed to cut through her composure. "Alexander, please. And yes, everything's fine. But I'd like to know how you're doing." Emma's chest tightened. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching too closely, and leaned slightly toward him. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered fiercely. "Not like this. Everyone knows now. They're talking and they think I'm—" She broke off, her voice cracking. "They think you're what?" Alexander asked gently. "That I'm getting special treatment," she hissed, blinking back sudden tears. "That I only still have this job because of you. Do you know how humiliating that is? I've worked myself into the ground just to prove I belong here, and now it looks like pity is the only reason I'm standing." Her words spilled out sharper than she intended, but Alexander didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his gaze intent. "Emma, you belong here because of your work, your resilience, and your determination. Nothing I did changes that. What I did was stop someone from treating you like you didn't matter. That's not special treatment. That's justice." She shook her head, biting her lip. "Easy for you to say. You're the millionaire CEO. People listen to you. When you speak, the world shifts. When I speak, no one even notices." Alexander's expression softened, something almost pain flickering in his eyes. "You're wrong. I noticed. From the first night I came here, I noticed the way you carried yourself, the way you worked until you could barely stand. You think no one sees you, but I see you, Emma, and I can't ignore it." The honesty in his tone caught her off guard, leaving her silent. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, her guardedness clashing with his steady determination. Then she pulled back, her mask sliding back into place. "I need to get back to work," she said stiffly, turning before he could reply. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Emma avoided his gaze, keeping herself busy with orders and trays, but she felt his presence like a shadow at her back. When the restaurant finally emptied and the lights dimmed, she walked out into the cool night air, only to find Alexander waiting by the door. "Emma," he said softly as she tried to brush past him. She stopped, sighing. "Why are you doing this? Why me? You could have left things the way they were. You could have just walked away." He held her gaze, his brown eyes steady in the dim streetlight. "Because I've spent years walking away, Emma. From people, from problems, from things that didn't fit neatly into my world. But I couldn't walk away from you. Not when I see how hard you fight every day just to keep your head above water. Not when I know I can make a difference." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes. She turned her face away quickly, unwilling to let him see. "I don't need saving," she whispered. "I'm not here to save you." Alexander said firmly. I'm here to stand beside you. The words lingered in the air, heavy and unexpected. Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she walked away into the night, her mind spinning, her heart tangled between gratitude, resentment, and something she wasn't ready to name. And Alexander watched her go, knowing that the story between them was far from finished. The story broke faster than Emma could have imagined. Within a week, local papers and online blogs had picked it up. Millionaire CEO goes undercover, defends exhausted waitress. Headlines spread across social media, complete with exaggerated retellings and grainy photos of the restaurant snapped by. Curious customers. Emma's name was mentioned in whispers, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with envy, and sometimes with cruel judgment. She had wanted to remain invisible, a nameless worker blending into the endless cycle of shifts. Now her invisibility was gone. At the restaurant, everything felt different. Customers began coming in not just for food, but to catch a glimpse of the waitress the CEO had saved. Some smiled warmly at her, leaving generous tips, while others stared like she was part of a spectacle. Her co-workers were even harder to face. Some of them congratulated her through gritted teeth, their eyes sharp with resentment. Others barely spoke to her at all, their silence more cutting than words. Emma tried to bury herself in her work, forcing her smile, keeping her tray balanced, pretending the stares didn't weigh her down. But every night when she walked home to her tiny apartment, she felt the pressure pressing in on her chest. The very things she had feared most had come true. People thought she only had her job because of Alexander Hale. They couldn't see the years of exhaustion, the double shifts, the sacrifices she had made to keep her life from collapsing. They only saw her as the girl who got lucky. Meanwhile, Alexander was moving swiftly. His revelation as the undercover CEO had caused ripples throughout his company. At headquarters, executives buzzed with anxiety as he ordered reviews of scheduling policies, pay structures, and working conditions across the restaurant chain. We will not run on the backs of broken employees, he told them in a boardroom meeting, his tone leaving no room for argument. If Emma Brooks's story exists in one location, it exists everywhere. And I won't let it continue. But while Alexander leaned into the fight, Emma struggled under its weight. One evening, after a particularly grueling day where two co-workers refused to share a shift with her out of spite, she stepped outside into the alley behind the restaurant, trying to catch her breath. The night air was cool, but her cheeks burned with frustration. She pressed her back against the brick wall and let out a shaky breath, fighting the tears threatening to spill. That was when she heard footsteps. Alexander appeared from the shadows, dressed simply as always, his dark hair slightly tousled, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't be here, Emma said quickly, wiping her eyes. Every time you show up, it gets worse for me. I know, he admitted, his voice calm. I didn't plan to come in tonight. I just wanted to see how you were holding up. Emma laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and tired. Holding up? I'm falling apart. Do you have any idea what it's like to walk into work and feel every pair of eyes on you? To know they're all thinking I'm weak, that I only matter because the boss took pity on me? Alexander stepped closer, his voice low but firm. You don't matter because of me. You matter because of you. Because you worked harder than anyone in that building. Because you gave until you had nothing left. I didn't create your worth, Emma. I just refused to let them trample it. She shook her head, her blonde hair catching the glow of the streetlight. Easy for you to say. You have power. You can stand up in a room and people listen. Me? I'm just tired. I'm just one person trying not to drown. For the first time, Alexander's calm cracked. He moved even closer, his brown eyes burning with intensity. Don't you understand? That's exactly why your story matters. You think you're just one person, but you've become the reason this company is changing. People are paying attention. Policies are shifting. You've already done what I couldn't. Put a human face on the problem. Emma's throat tightened. His words carried truth, but they also felt like a burden she hadn't asked for. She didn't want to be a symbol, didn't want to be the face of reform. She just wanted to live quietly, to survive without the world watching. I didn't ask for this, she whispered. I know, Alexander said softly, his voice gentling. But sometimes the things we don't ask for are the ones that change everything. For a long moment they stood in the quiet alley, the distance between them charged with unspoken words. Emma felt the weight of his gaze steady and grounding, and for the first time in days her breathing slowed. She didn't thank him. She couldn't, not yet, but she didn't turn away either. When she finally returned inside, the whispers still followed her, but somewhere deep inside, a new thought had taken root. Maybe she wasn't just the girl who got lucky. Maybe she was the beginning of something bigger. And Alexander, watching her disappear through the door, knew he would do everything in his power to make sure she never carried that weight alone again. The weeks that followed were some of the most complicated of Emma's life. Every day she walked into the restaurant, bracing herself for the whispers, the lingering stares, the subtle jabs from co-workers who resented her newfound attention. Some shifted extra work onto her, convinced she would never be reprimanded. Others refused to speak to her at all, treating her as if she were an outsider in a place she had once blended into seamlessly. The air felt thick with judgment, and no matter how hard she tried, Emma could not shake the feeling that her every move was being scrutinized. But the truth was, the weight pressing on her chest had less to do with her coworkers than with the man whose presence loomed over her thoughts. Alexander Hale. He appeared less frequently now, knowing his visits stirred chaos, yet she still caught sight of him from time to time. Slipping into the corner booth, his dark eyes scanning the room not like a customer, but like someone looking for her specifically. He spoke less when others were around, but when they were alone, even for a moment, the intensity in his gaze was undeniable. And that intensity frightened her almost as much as it drew her in. One late evening, after a shift that had left her legs aching and her spirit raw, Emma stepped outside to find Alexander waiting by the sidewalk. His figure was silhouetted against the glow of the street lamps, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Posture casual but purposeful. She froze for a moment, torn between anger and something softer she didn't dare name. "You really shouldn't be here," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "Every time you show up, it makes my life harder." He nodded slowly as if he had expected the reaction. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I couldn't leave things the way they are. You don't deserve to be punished for my choices." Emma folded her arms, clutching herself against the night breeze. "You think standing out here, waiting for me, fixes anything? People look at me like I'm some charity case now. I've worked so hard to prove I'm not weak, and you turned me into a headline." Her words hit hard, but Alexander didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his brown eyes steady on hers. "I didn't turn you into a headline. The world did. All I did was refuse to let you be crushed under a system that was breaking you. I can't apologize for standing up when it mattered." Emma shook her head, fighting the swirl of emotions. Gratitude clashed with anger. Shame warred with something dangerously close to admiration. She wanted to hate him for making her visible, but part of her couldn't forget the way his voice had cut through the chaos that night, steady and unwavering, like a shield she had never had before. "Why me?" she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "Why did you care so much about me? You could have walked away. You could have kept your distance. Why didn't you?" For the first time, Alexander's composure faltered. He looked away briefly, as though searching for words, then met her gaze again with a raw honesty that left her breathless. "Because I saw you. Really saw you. You weren't just another employee, Emma. You were someone who carried more than anyone should, and you still kept going. I couldn't walk away from that. I didn't want to." The silence between them grew thick, charged with something neither dared to name. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her throat tightening. She had spent so long building walls around herself, determined never to depend on anyone. But here was a man who had power enough to change her life with a single word. And instead of using that power to control her, he was offering it as a shield. "You make it sound so simple," she murmured, her voice trembling. "It's not simple," Alexander replied softly. "It's complicated, messy, risky, but sometimes the things that matter most are." Emma felt her defenses crumble just slightly. She wanted to step back, to protect herself from the storm that was building between them. But she found herself rooted in place. She looked up at him, and for the first time she saw not the millionaire CEO, not the powerful figure the world admired and feared, but a man, tired, flawed, and startlingly sincere. "I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't want anything from you," Alexander said firmly. "I just don't want you to feel alone anymore." The words settled into her chest, heavier than she could bear. Emma turned away quickly, blinking back tears, afraid that if she looked at him too long, she would break. She muttered a goodbye and walked into the night, her steps hurried, her heart tangled. But as Alexander watched her disappear down the street, he knew the truth she wasn't ready to admit. The distance she tried to put between them was crumbling, and so was his carefully constructed control. The first signs of spring arrived quietly, with longer days and the faint perfume of blossoms carried on the evening wind. For Emma, the change in season mirrored the shift inside her own heart. Weeks had passed since Alexander first revealed himself, and though she still wrestled with doubt, something inside her had begun to soften. The fear of being judged, the shame of her exhaustion, the anger at being thrust into the spotlight. All of it was still there, but less sharp, dulled by the way Alexander continued to show up, not as a savior demanding gratitude, but as a man who refused to let her stand alone. On a Sunday evening after her shift, the restaurant quieter than usual, Alexander appeared again. He didn't come in grandly, didn't make an announcement. He simply waited outside, leaning casually against a lamppost, his dark hair ruffled by the breeze, his brown eyes calm but searching. Emma stepped out the door, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders, and stopped short when she saw him. "You're persistent," she said softly, though the bite in her words had faded. "I told you," he answered gently. "I'm not walking away." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Emma looked at him, really looked at him. The millionaire CEO who had everything, standing in the cool evening air, as if nothing else mattered but being here. She thought of the walls she had built, the years of telling herself she didn't need anyone, the endless nights of fighting to survive alone. And now here was someone breaking through, not with force, but with quiet, unwavering presence. They walked together down the quiet street, their steps in sync. Neither spoke for several blocks, the silence strangely comfortable. Finally, Emma broke it. "Do you ever wonder if you made the wrong choice? Coming into my world? Getting involved when you didn't have to?" Alexander's gaze shifted toward her, steady and unflinching. "Every choice I've made until now was about control, about building, expanding, winning. And I thought that was what mattered. But then I met you, and for the first time I realized how blind I'd been. You've shown me something I couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate, couldn't control. You've shown me what resilience looks like, what humanity looks like. So no, Emma, I don't wonder if it was wrong. I wonder why it took me so long to find it." Her throat tightened, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She turned her face away, but his words burrowed deep, loosening the final knots of resistance she had held on to. They reached a small park, nearly empty at this late hour. The trees whispered softly above them, the benches glistening faintly from a recent rain. Alexander stopped near one of them, turning to face her fully. His expression was serious, but there was vulnerability there too, a rare crack in the armor of a man used to command. "Emma," he said quietly, "I can't promise you a life without hardship. I can't promise the world will stop whispering or that people won't judge. But I can promise you this. I will stand with you, not as your boss, not as some CEO trying to prove a point, but as a man who believes in you, who cares about you. And if you'll let me, I want to build something real with you." The confession hit her like a wave, sweeping away the doubts she had clung to. She saw the truth in his eyes. Not pity, not obligation, but something genuine, something that terrified her because of how much she wanted to believe it. "I don't know how to let someone in," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I've been on my own for so long. It feels like if I lean on anyone, I'll lose myself." Alexander stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Then don't lean. Walk beside me. That's all I ask." The dam inside her finally cracked. Emma let out a trembling breath, tears spilling freely now. She didn't care if he saw them. She didn't care if the world still thought she was weak. For the first time in years, she felt the weight begin to lift. Not because someone had saved her, but because someone had chosen to stand with her, to see her, to remind her that she didn't have to carry everything alone. Slowly she nodded, a small, fragile smile breaking through the tears. "Okay," she whispered, "beside you." Alexander exhaled, a mixture of relief and something deeper crossing his features. He reached out, gently brushing away a tear from her cheek, his touch warm and careful. For a long moment, they stood in the quiet park, the world around them fading until it was only the two of them. Two people from different worlds, bound now by something stronger than circumstance. That night marked the end of one story, the story of a waitress drowning in exhaustion, a CEO hiding behind control, and the beginning of another. A story not of saving or being saved, but of two lives intertwined by choice, by resilience, and by the fragile, stubborn hope that love could grow in the most unexpected places. As I reflect on the ending of this story, what strikes me most is not just the romance between Alexander and Emma, but the transformation that both characters undergo. At its heart, this isn't simply a tale about a millionaire CEO rescuing a struggling waitress. It's about two people learning to see each other's humanity beyond the roles the world assigned them. Alexander begins the story hidden behind power, control, and disguise. For him, Emma becomes a mirror that forces him to confront the gaps in his empire, but also in his own heart. Emma, in turn, starts as someone defined by exhaustion and invisibility. By the end, she doesn't just receive his support, she reclaims her own worth, realizing she deserves to be seen not as a symbol, but as herself. The beauty of this conclusion is that it resists the cliché of saving. Instead, it frames their connection as partnership, not a millionaire fixing a broken life, but two individuals walking side by side, each teaching the other something vital. Alexander learns compassion and vulnerability. Emma learns that strength can also mean allowing someone else in. For me, the ending carries a quiet but powerful message. Real change, whether in business, love, or life, begins when we stop pretending to be untouchable and start letting others see us as we are. And sometimes the most shocking thing isn't the grand gesture. It's the simple act of choosing not to walk away.